I am going to be introducing Susan Southard. Susan will be introducing the nonfiction runner-up, Michelle Kuo. Susan Southard, the 2016 Dayton Literary Peace Prize nonfiction winner for Nagasaki, holds an MFA in creative writing from Antioch University, Los Angeles, and was a nonfiction fellow at the Norman Mailer Center in Massachusetts. Nagasaki also won the J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize, sponsored by the Neiman Foundation at Harvard University in the Columbia School of Journalism. Nagasaki has been published in England, Denmark, Spain, Taiwan, and China, and next year it will be published in Japan. Southard is the founder and artistic director of Essential Theater in Tempe, Arizona. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome my good friend, Susan Southard.
Min was right, it is different up here. Hi, everybody. It's so wonderful to be back. Thank you to Sharon and Mark for allowing me to be back. And this year I was really privileged to serve as one of the 2 nonfiction judges. And it is an extraordinary honor for me to introduce to you Michelle Kuo and her beautiful book, Reading with Patrick, a teacher, a student, and a life-changing friendship. I went to the Mississippi Delta, Michelle writes in the opening paragraph of her book, with a specific project: to teach American history through Black literature. I imagined teaching literature that had moved me. I envisioned my students galvanized, as I had been in the 8th grade, by Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail, and mesmerized as I had been in high school by Malcolm X's autobiography. Books had taught me to admire a person's will to confront the world, to evaluate his experience honestly, as Ralph Ellison wrote. Books had changed me, charged me with responsibilities. And I believed that books could change the lives of my students. I was unabashedly romantic. I was 22. And there begins the story of a young woman daring to turn away from her family's expectations and go to Helena, Arkansas, one of the most impoverished regions of our country. It is the story of her entering into the 8th grade classroom of a last chance alternative school for students considered unteachable. It is the story of the young students gradually opening up to her and to their own hunger to learn and express themselves in writing. It is the story of the relationship between this teacher, Michelle Kuo, and Patrick Browning, a young man who demonstrated great gifts as a writer, even as he carried within him intense burdens of our country's history. And it is a story of literature itself and its ability to penetrate suffering and offer connection, meaning, and new possibilities for how we see the world. I, for one, felt like I was in Michelle's classroom with her, and later in the jail where Patrick awaits his murder trial. She humbly exposes her own naivete, misjudgments, and doubts, and brings alive the humanity and vulnerability of her students, most especially Patrick. I don't want to tell you more, with the hope that if you haven't already, you'll read Reading with Patrick very soon. What I can say is that Michelle's honest, nuanced, and intimate storytelling offers us a way to enter the world of Helena, Arkansas, and grapple with some of the profound issues of our time, including the legacy of slavery, class inequality, personal and community identity, and how we in this country educate or don't educate our children. Toward the end of the book, Michelle contemplates how Patrick's life might have gone differently if she had stayed in the Delta. She admits that it's wishful thinking that she might have saved him, as if, she writes, "I think I'm so important in his life." It's not like that, she adds. Or maybe it is, in the sense that the alternative, the rational thought, would be to say to myself, "You can't do that much. You're not that important. There are so many forces in a person's life, good and bad. Who do you think you are?" That's what I said to make myself feel better after I left the Delta, she writes, and sometimes I still say it. But then what is a human for? A person must matter to another. It must mean something for two people to have passed time together, to have put work into each other and into becoming more fully themselves. And isn't that what the Dayton Literary Peace Prize is all about? About stories that matter to who we are as individuals and nations, about expanding our understanding of the way others live on this planet, past and present, about opening our hearts and becoming as accountable as possible for the impact of our actions on others. For all these reasons and more, I ask you to please join me in congratulating and welcoming to the stage this year's Dayton Literary Peace Prize runner-up in nonfiction, Michelle Kuo. Where is she?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Susan. That was such a generous and kind introduction. And thank you, Sharon, and the volunteers, the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, the first readers, the people who have been taking such good care of us. I'm from Kalamazoo, Michigan, and I feel at home. Thank you, Ohio. I cannot resist. I am so happy that Will started by telling us there are high school students here. Could you just stand up if you're in high school right now? Stay standing. Could you stand up if you're in college? Yes. Stay standing, please. Could you stand up if you're a teacher or have taught? To all of you who are students, you can write a book. You shall write a book. You write a little every day and hate yourself for a long time. Somebody asked me recently at a reading, why did it take you so long to write? And I said, insecurity and self-doubt. And that pretty much finished it. And for those of you who are teachers, I wrote this book for you to honor your work. It is the hardest job that exists. It's a job, the only job I know, where you have to be on your feet all day, where you work with people every day, where you're a counselor, where you're a therapist, where you're a teacher, where you're a transmitter of information, where you're a friend. So thank you for what you do. I want to start by telling you a little bit about the story that Susan started to tell. I didn't grow up with many Asian Americans. I think that's why I was drawn to African American literature. It was my way of proving that I was American, that I was the best kind of American, a citizen who cared about our history, a citizen who cared about minorities. And I was struck by James Baldwin from a very early age. He said, if we are to change the racial nightmare and change the history of the world, we must insist, like lovers, on the consciousness of the other. That word lovers is so strong. It's a word we reserve for usually one person in our life, not the whole world, certainly not strangers, certainly not people of a different race. When I went to the Mississippi Delta, I was drawn to the history. It was 2004, and I was drawn to the history of the 1960s. This is a place where Stokely Carmichael came up with the term Black Power. This is a place where Martin Luther King, a man who had seen it all by 1964, wept when he saw 4 kids sharing an apple. And I wanted to continue that movement. But this is also a story of incredibly naive optimism. And so I myself was shocked when I found a place that was still poor, still segregated, and still dramatically in need of change. I made a lot of mistakes in the classroom. By the time I figured out how to teach, I was about to leave. The student in this book, Patrick, was 15. He was a peaceful kid. He broke up fights. He loved silent reading. He was curious about the world. Our roof had a leak, and he was the kid who would show up with a bucket and mop while we were all complaining. And Patrick had just one problem, which was attendance. He had trouble coming to school. And because I was crazy and 22, I would just show up at his house and be like, hey, you need to come to school. And he came. He came the next day. His mother was working 2 jobs on minimum wage, and there just wasn't anybody at home to help him come. She was overwhelmed. He made incredible progress in this classroom. He got the Most Improved Student Award. He was flourishing. He was writing poetry. And I got into law school. My immigrant parents were thrilled. They were like, why are you in Arkansas being a teacher? And they also noted strongly that I was single and said, nobody wants to marry Mother Teresa. Thank you, Mom. She also noted that all my friends who were staying, which was a true observation, tended to be in couples, because if you live in a rural area, you know that it's difficult to date. It's quite lonely. I left right when Patrick was flourishing. I thought to myself, this is too early. This isn't the time yet to go and better myself. But I left. And I found out 3 years later from a friend that Patrick had gotten into a fight and killed someone. I was shocked. I didn't believe that this was true. And as I look back at this now, I recognize that that kind of shock is a reflection of a middle-class upbringing. That when you get caught up in violence, it often has almost nothing to do with so-called character. It has to do with poverty and with the feeling of needing to defend yourself. And that is exactly what happened in Patrick's situation. His sister, who was younger and was special ed, hadn't come home from school on a school night. It was nearly midnight, and Patrick's mom had asked him to go find his sister. Patrick is the man of the house. He has 3 younger sisters, and he went to find her. He couldn't find her. He felt like he let his mother down. And right when he got back to his house, he saw his sister. She was with an older man in the neighborhood who was 25 and heavily drunk. The autopsy would have it at .26 later on. He kept telling the guy to get off the porch, get off my porch. The guy wouldn't get off his porch, and Patrick got a knife and stabbed him. This is not an atypical story. It's a story of somebody defending himself who is sure that police will not defend him. It's also a story, I think, that is typical in the sense of how much race is a part of it. He was charged with first-degree murder. On the first day of any criminal law class, you know that this is not first-degree murder. It's not premeditated. And also, one wonders if whether he would have been charged had he not been black, since he was on his property, and the quote-unquote aggressor was an African American who was heavily inebriated. The book, though, isn't really about this crime. The book is about Patrick and how he was doing. When I went to find him in the county jail of Arkansas, he didn't want to talk about his legal defenses, self-defense, provocation. He wanted to feel guilty. No matter how much I tried to tell him about the sociological origins of crime, about poverty, about how this wouldn't have happened if he had been born in a different zip code, he didn't want to talk about that. And I want us to think about that, but about the kind of guilt a person feels, about what happens in our lives when we carry that guilt with ourselves and do not forgive ourselves. And this book is really about mercy, about ways we find mercy to forgive ourselves. Because Patrick didn't want to talk about the crime, I realized I had nothing to talk about. I thought I had this great idea of having him write a letter to his young daughter, who we felt he had let down. And Patrick's letter to his daughter was something that I didn't recognize. I didn't recognize his handwriting. His skills had regressed since he dropped out of school. And even more than that was the content of the letter. It basically said, "I'm sorry for letting you down. I'm sorry for not being there for you." So I asked myself, how could I convince him that he had something worthwhile to share? Something more than just apology. And that's when I started bringing books to jail. I brought poetry. I brought picture books of trees and birds. I brought Frederick Douglass, James Baldwin, all of this literature to see what he would fall in love with. We memorized so much poetry, and because we're in such a literary audience, just a couple of poems. Haikus, which we learn in kindergarten, get a bad rap, are actually a deceptively simple masterpiece. This one is about the first day of snowfall, deer licking first frost off each other's coats. Another, quite funny, "Don't worry, spiders, I keep house casually." And this one, "Napped half the day, no one punished me." We read Frederick Douglass. When I read Frederick Douglass growing up, I thought of him as a kind of icon, an American hero, an uplifting story of somebody who escaped slavery and became the world's greatest orator and writer and abolitionist. Patrick read the story very differently. It put him in a state of panic. There's a part in Douglass's book that I didn't remember reading growing up, where the masters give slaves gin on Christmas Day as a way to trick them so that they would be stumbling on the fields and believe that they don't deserve freedom. When Patrick read this part, I could tell he wanted to stop reading because it hit him so hard. There's a line in Douglass where he says, it's this everlasting thinking of my condition that torments me. And Patrick said to me, he related to Douglass. And then he said, but I'm not good like him. And I wish he had known then how much he seemed like Douglass to me, how he kept reading in a concrete stairway with no light in the jail, how he finished the book before me, even though it was painful for him to read it. We read Marilyn Robinson. She has this line, it's a fictional dad to his son that says, if you ever wonder what you've done in this life, and everybody does wonder, you have been a miracle to me, more than a miracle. And something about this language stirred his desire to write to his own daughter, and his notebook became filled with hundreds of letters to her. Imagining them going down the Mississippi River, imagining them reading together, imagining them finding a mountain to climb together. And I thought to myself, and I ask all of you this today too, how many of you have let down somebody and faced them every day, word by word, holding yourself accountable? It takes courage to do that. The story doesn't end here. There's indisputable intellectual transformation for both of us. But when he gets out of prison, he's still struggling. His food stamps get cut off. He's been homeless. He's been hungry. His mother, who was his best friend, passes away. He has child support debt that is staggering. It's impossible to pay off. He doesn't have health care, so that health care bill gets sent to a collection agency. And so usually I just end here and I'm like, well, what can books do? Did books change his life? But because we're here, I just want to add a few ways to answer that question instead of leaving you on that stark note. I do believe books did change a few things. Books charged his inner life with beauty, with imagination. Books gave him images and that gave him joy: deer, frost, mountain, water. Books gave him a language for what he had lost in his life. They gave him a language to speak to his daughter. Books taught him his own courage. I think one reason people don't read is because reading is difficult. Reading is a form of thinking, and he chose to think rather than to not think. How he kept reading Douglas even though it hurt. And last, the story is also about us. How reading gave us a fleeting feeling of equality, where neither one of us had a better interpretation, where each of us brought to the room a private feeling. I still don't know exactly what the story is about because the ending is still ongoing. He is still struggling. I'm still struggling. And we're not in the same place anymore. And so I just want to say at the very end that of this talk that even though I'm up here standing on a slightly elevated thing, I forget what it's called. It's a thing. We are all trying to find meaning in our lives. I know everybody in this room is. And I do believe that we find it when we step outside of our circles, when we dare to make mistakes, as we will when we try to forge connections with other people of different backgrounds. In this case of a person who is apparently violent, he found a little piece of utopia in books and in literature, and so did I. And in those moments in jail, we did share that utopia, even though I got to leave and he had to stay. And I just want to end by saying, when one writer was asked why she wrote, she said, "One must create a world in which one must live." And that is what I found with my students. That is what I found with myself. And that is why I so admire my fellow winners who I've had such a delight to meet, John, Hala, Minjin, Tanahasi, and Spirit. And so I want to thank you all for being such a wonderful audience today and for being readers, for welcoming us here, for creating a space where we can have our little piece of utopia. Thank you.